Quilty is brought to you by
APQS, handcrafted quilting machines. Aurifil Italian thread, perfectly suited for all your quilting projects. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing.
Havel's Sewing. When you need to cut it close, choose Havel's.
Moda, make something quilty with Moda fabrics.
Hello and welcome to Quilty. Marianne Fons, welcome to Quilty.
Thanks for having me come on the show today.
You know, I always say welcome to the guests because you are so welcome here.
Oh.
Everyone is so welcome here when they come on the show.
And you are welcome here too.
And you are welcome here too.
And I'm so happy that you invited me on the show to talk about the 1/4 inch seam. And as before the cameras rolled, I was thinking, you know, I remember when you took your first steps. I remember when you spoke your first words. Before you even took your first steps.
Oh my God.
And when you learned to read. And these are very, very watershed moments.
Yeah, they're milestones.
And after that, when you learn to sew a 1/4 inch seam. Because it's very important. It's a fundamental thing to know. And, you know, we love making quilts. It's so much fun. And if you master the 1/4 inch seam so that it's accurate, you will have such a happy time making quilts.
The world is your oyster. It's like if you can learn to walk, you'll really go places.
You can learn to drive.
Yeah.
And so when I emphasize to people the importance of a 1/4 inch seam, I don't want to come off like I'm this picky person.
No.
It's not that I am judging. It's just that life is going to be happier if your blocks turn out the right size, if your units turn out the right size, and that all depends on sewing an accurate 1/4 inch seam.
I like to say if you fudge a little bit here and you fudge a little bit there, you end up with a whole pan of fudge.
Yeah, well, that's right. And even with really accurate 1/4 inch sewing, you still have to fudge once in a while because fabric is woven and it's fluid. But if you're inaccurate, it's just fudging all the time.
Right. And so on today's show, we're going to show you how to measure your 1/4 inch seam accurately to make sure that you're truly sewing a 1/4 inch seam. Because it's not that you would sew your 1/4 inch seam and then throw your ruler down on what you've just sewn to see if it's a 1/4 inch, because that's actually not the best way to measure.
And we're going to explain why. Because, you know, what you're going to do is give yourself a test. It's a self-test. It's a 1/4 inch seam test. And just as Mary was saying, and we're going to turn this over so the thread shows, when I taught for, you know, decades out there, you know, like I said, I've been in more church basements than most people.
Yeah.
From sea to shining sea teaching quilting. My students sometimes would say, well, I'm sewing an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And they would take a ruler of some kind and they would measure this seam and say, look, it's a 1/4 inch. Well, are they including the thread in that 1/4 inch? And so my message to everybody was measure the result of your seam, not the seam.
Huge difference.
Okay, so what we have here is there's a little math involved here, 2 3.5 inch squares. We cut them 3.5 inches. If you have cut a 3.5 inch square, it will finish 3 inches because you've got 2 1/4 inch seam allowances
that are going away.
Or on all the sides. So we've sewn this 1/4 inch seam. Then you want to open the seam, and you can finger press it, or but you want to get it fully open. It's a closed seam in that both seam allowances go one way, but it's an open seam in terms of no little pleats in there. Okay, so if we have 3 inches finished and 3 inches finished, we've taken away 1 1/4 inch seam. So this should now measure 6.5 inches.
Exactly.
3 inches and 3 inches plus 2 1/4 inch seams. So
let's see if it does, and then we'll tell you if it's not. What may have gone wrong.
So here we are. Here it is from 1 inch to 6.5 inches.
Beautiful.
So
if your piece, if you opened it up and you pressed it well, and it was too big, if it was like measuring 6 7/8,
your seam is too shallow.
It's too shallow. You haven't your seam allowance is not you haven't eaten up enough fabric, and if it's too short, you're taking too big of a bite,
deep.
right?
And people tend to sew a little too deep.
Yep.
And also, you have to cut accurately.
Well, absolutely.
So if you measured your seam test and something wasn't right and you were pretty sure you'd sewn accurately, check your cutting.
Absolutely.
And I thought what would be really neat to finish this, so give yourself the seam test, but I thought you should show the nifty thing you have on your sewing machine, because everybody's got a different kind of sewing machine. Sometimes you have a 1/4 inch mark on your throat plate, sometimes your foot is a 1/4 inch wide, and what the sewing machine companies are always trying to help us do better, and so you have the foot on your Baby Lock machine that actually has a guide to help you. It doesn't work on every kind of sewing.
No.
Like flippy corners, you can't use it for that.
Right.
But let's show how to sew it.
How about I do that, and then the last thing I want to touch on before the show is over today is the scant thing. So I want to talk about that because that's important. Okay?
Well, yes, that's a perfect way to end. You sew that and we'll talk about the scantiness.
Okay, so I'm going to put my piece down, drop my presser foot, and this little guide is where I just run my patchwork right up against that edge.
And you know, when the machine companies came out with these guides, I was sort of poo-pooed them because I learned without it, you know, and I learned, but I think it is a great like training wheels for people.
It is, and I just, it makes it, I don't know, I don't have to think, you know, I just sort of put it up against that and that's it.
So here's our 1/4 inch seam. And what Mary's talking about in terms of scantness.
Yeah, this is important. So pay attention because you hear this a lot.
If you're going to err at all, we're talking about being exactly accurate. But the thread takes up a tiny amount. And here's one final tip is don't use thick thread for your patchwork.
Well, that's
use a
true.
high quality, finer thread because then it doesn't make bulk.
Well, and I just want to make sure we're very clear about what we mean when we say scant 1/4 inch. So what people say, they say, well, you should sew a 1/4 inch seam. You should sew a scant 1/4 inch seam. That means just like the thread's width
is included in that.
So it's it's included in the 1/4 inch. So you're just sewing just a scotch less than a 1/4 inch. That's what they mean.
Because when you fold this over, that thread
does take
takes
up some,
and which is nothing until you've got 1,000 pieces in your quilt.
Right. But I feel like if you're consistently sewing a scant 1/4 inch or consistently sewing a true 1/4 inch, you're fine.
You're fine.
It's just the consistency that you have to keep in mind.
Well, yes, it's consistency. Yeah. Well, it should be an accurate 1/4 inch because once you get into triangles and so forth,
absolutely.
Absolutely. Because some people say, oh, as long as you do the same. Well, if you're only sewing squares, that's okay. But the minute you get into triangles, which everybody should, that accuracy. So take the seam test and then go from there. You know, you took your I remember when you took your driver's test too. You know, that was important.
I'm just walking down memory lane here, and what else do I have to discover? You know, childbirth. I have to give birth to my first child.
Well, that's
maybe someday. Don't hold your breath.
Well. These are milestones.
Milestones. Thanks for watching Quilty, and make your own milestones. Make your first big quilt this summer or this winter or something big. Okay, bye.
Quilty is brought to you by
APQS, handcrafted quilting machines. Aurifil Italian thread, perfectly suited for all your quilting projects. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing.
Havel Sewing. When you need to cut it close, choose Havel's.
Moda, make something quilty with Moda fabrics.